to Georgia authorities on charges of conspiring to overturn the 2020 election.
Meadows was booked and fingerprinted and paid his $100,000 bond as well.
Meanwhile, joining us now, actually, is senior investigative reporter Aaron Katersky. He is outside the Fulton County Jail, where Trump will actually be surrendering within a few hours. Also, investigative reporter and producer Olivia Rubin, nearby at the Fulton County Courthouse, is with us, and Chief Justice correspondent Pierre Thomas is here with us in Washington, D.C.
So, Aaron, let's begin with you. Mark Meadows has turned himself in, been arraigned, fingerprinted, got his mugshot.
Mark Meadows has emerged as one of the most consequential figures in the ongoing investigations into the 2020 election aftermath, and the revelations tied to his testimony are reshaping the political landscape in ways that demand serious attention. As former White House Chief of Staff, Meadows occupied a unique position at the intersection of power and decision-making during one of the most turbulent periods in recent American history. His surrender to authorities in Georgia marked a turning point that extended far beyond a single legal proceeding, signaling that accountability mechanisms were beginning to reach the highest levels of the previous administration. The significance of his cooperation cannot be overstated, as it represents a bridge between internal White House operations and external investigative oversight. The charges connected to efforts to overturn the election results have placed Meadows at the center of a legal storm that continues to expand with each passing development. Prosecutors have assembled a comprehensive case that draws upon documented testimony, internal communications, and a wealth of digital evidence that paints a detailed picture of the pressure campaigns that unfolded in the weeks following the election. What makes this situation particularly noteworthy is the breadth of documentation that has surfaced, including text messages, emails, and memoranda that provide contemporaneous accounts of the decision-making processes within the executive branch. This paper trail has proven invaluable to investigators seeking to establish a clear timeline of events and identify the specific actions taken by key figures. The congressional response to these revelations has been both swift and remarkably bipartisan, reflecting the gravity of the circumstances that have unfolded.
So we are learning new details this morning about the two separate grand juries looking into former President Donald Trump's handling of classified documents after leaving the White House. First, NBC News has learned roughly 24 Secret Service agents have been subpoenaed or have appeared before the federal grand jury in Washington, D.C. That's according to two sources familiar with the matter. They say the testimony took place in the past few months, meaning not recently, as the grand jury has been on hiatus. At the same time, the New York Times reports a previously unknown federal grand jury in Miami, Florida, started hearing testimony in the classified documents case last.
Lawmakers took the rare step of holding Meadows in contempt of Congress, a move that underscored the seriousness with which they viewed his initial resistance to cooperating with the January 6th investigation. This contempt citation was not merely symbolic. It represented a formal declaration that the legislative branch would not tolerate obstruction when seeking answers about an attack on the democratic process. The subsequent referral of Trump for potential criminal charges related to obstruction and conspiracy demonstrated that Congress was willing to pursue accountability regardless of political implications. Comparisons to historic political scandals have become increasingly common as this situation has developed, and these analogies merit careful consideration. The parallels to Watergate are particularly striking, given the central role that internal documentation and insider testimony have played in illuminating conduct that was previously hidden from public view. Just as the Nixon administration's downfall was accelerated by the revelations of key aides who chose to cooperate with investigators, the current circumstances suggest that similar dynamics may be at play. The comparison extends beyond superficial similarities to encompass fundamental questions about the abuse of executive power and the mechanisms available to check such abuses. The gap between public pronouncements and private actions has emerged as a recurring theme throughout this saga, and this dissonance lies at the heart of the accountability efforts now underway. Public statements made in the heat of political battle often bear little resemblance to the private communications that have since come to light, creating a record that is difficult to reconcile with official narratives. This divergence has provided investigators with a rich vein of evidence to explore, as they seek to determine whether public claims were knowingly false or merely the product of wishful thinking taken to extremes. The distinction matters greatly for legal purposes, even as both scenarios raise troubling questions about the responsible execution exercise of power. The role of state-level prosecutions in this broader accountability landscape deserves particular attention, as the Georgia case represents a significant departure from federal investigative efforts. By pursuing charges at the state level, prosecutors have introduced a parallel track of accountability that operates independently of federal proceedings and cannot be easily derailed by changes in administration or shifts in Department of Justice priorities. This multi-jurisdictional approach has created a complex legal environment where defendants must navigate overlapping investigations with distinct procedural requirements and potential consequences. The Georgia case, in particular, has drawn scrutiny for its comprehensive approach to charging decisions and its willingness to name high-profile defendants. Internal communications have proven to be the linchpin of investigative efforts, providing investigators with unfiltered access to the deliberations that shape post-election strategy. These communications reveal a White House operating in crisis mode, with staffers expressing varying degrees of concern about the legality and wisdom of proposed courses of action. The preservation of these records, despite efforts to obscure or destroy evidence, speaks to the difficulty of maintaining secrecy in an era of digital communication. Each message and memorandum adds another piece to a puzzle that investigators have been assembling with methodical precision. The psychological dimension of cooperation decisions cannot be ignored when analyzing the behavior of figures like Meadows, who have found themselves caught between competing loyalties. The pressure to remain loyal to a former president must be weighed against the legal and personal costs of resisting cooperation with duly constituted authorities. For some, the calculation has tilted toward cooperation, as the scope of potential exposure has become clear and the prospect of individual legal jeopardy has materialized. These decisions are rarely made lightly, and they often reflect a complex mixture of self-interest, legal advice, and genuine concern about the consequences of continued resistance. The institutional implications of these proceedings extend far beyond the immediate fate of any individual defendant. Congress has been forced to confront fundamental questions about its own power to investigate and punish executive branch misconduct, testing the limits of its constitutional authority in ways that will shape interbranch relations for years to come. The courts have been asked to adjudicate disputes that touch on core principles of executive privilege and the scope of congressional inquiry, setting precedents that will bind future administrations. These institutional stress tests are occurring against a backdrop of heightened political polarization that complicates efforts to achieve consensus on basic facts, let alone appropriate responses. The media's role in contextualizing and disseminating information about these developments has been subject to intense scrutiny from all sides of the political spectrum. Accurate reporting on complex legal proceedings requires a delicate balance between the public's right to know and the need to avoid prejudicing ongoing investigations or trials. The proliferation of competing narratives has made this task increasingly difficult, as partisan media outlets have often prioritized ideological alignment over factual precision. Responsible journalism in this environment demands a commitment to verification and a willingness to correct errors, even when doing so disappoints audience expectations. The international dimension of American political instability has not gone unnoticed by observers abroad, who have watched these developments with a mixture of concern and fascination. The United States has long positioned itself as a model of democratic stability and the rule of law, making visible cracks in that facade particularly consequential for global perceptions. Allies and adversaries alike have adjusted their assessments of American reliability and resilience based on the unfolding domestic drama, with potential implications for diplomatic and security relationships. The restoration of confidence in American institutions will require not just the resolution of specific legal cases, but a broader demonstration that accountability mechanisms remain functional. The economic implications of prolonged political uncertainty have manifested in various forms, from market volatility to delayed investment decisions by risk-averse actors. Businesses thrive on predictability, and the unpredictable nature of high-stakes political investigations creates an environment where long-term planning becomes difficult. The specific sectors most affected by this uncertainty tend to be those most exposed to regulatory decisions and government contracting, where the identity and stability of political leadership matters enormously. These economic effects, while secondary to the fundamental questions of democratic accountability at stake, nonetheless represent real costs that are borne by ordinary citizens. The social fabric of the nation has been visibly strained by the polarization that these investigations both reflect and exacerbate. Communities have been divided divided along lines of political affiliation, with relationships strained or severed over disagreements about the legitimacy of electoral outcomes and the appropriateness of various responses. The healing of these divisions will require more than the resolution of legal proceedings. It will demand a sustained effort to rebuild trust in shared institutions and a common factual foundation. Whether such reconciliation is possible in the current media environment remains an open question that troubles observers across the political spectrum. The legal strategies employed by defendants in these cases have evolved in response to the mounting evidence and the changing political landscape. Initial approaches centered on broad claims of executive privilege and immunity have given way to more targeted defenses as courts have narrowed the scope of available protections. The selection of legal counsel and the decision to cooperate or resist have been influenced by calculations about both legal outcomes and political positioning. These strategic choices have themselves become subjects of public interest and speculation, adding another layer of complexity to an already intricate situation. The technological aspects of the evidence gathering have introduced novel questions about privacy, surveillance, and the preservation of digital records in government service. The sheer volume of communications that have been recovered and analyzed represents a significant challenge for investigators and defense counsel alike, requiring sophisticated tools and methodologies to manage effectively. The authentication of digital evidence and the establishment of chain of custody have become critical issues in pretrial proceedings, with significant implications for the admissibility of key proof at trial. These technical dimensions of the cases are often overshadowed by political considerations, but remain essential to the ultimate disposition of charges. The historical record that is being created through these proceedings will serve as a primary source for future scholars seeking to understand this period of American history. The documentary evidence, testimony, and legal filings will provide a level of detail that is rarely available to historians studying contemporary events, offering insights into decision-making processes that are typically shielded from public view. The responsibility of current participants to ensure the accuracy and completeness of this record is a weighty one, as their actions will shape understanding of these events for generations to come. Historians will undoubtedly debate the significance of various developments and the motivations of key actors, but the underlying documentary foundation will constrain the range of plausible interpretation. The ethical dimensions of the conduct at issue in these investigations touch on fundamental questions about the nature of public service and the obligations of those who hold positions of trust. The distinction between legitimate political advocacy and improper pressure on electoral and judicial processes is one that has occupied philosophers and legal scholars for centuries, and these cases provide concrete context in which to apply abstract principles. The specific actions taken in the post-election period must be evaluated against established standards of professional conduct and ethical behavior, even where they may not have crossed the line into criminal liability. This ethical assessment is distinct from, though related to, the legal determinations that courts and juries must make. The comparative perspective offered by similar episodes in other democracies can illuminate both the unique and universal aspects of the current American situation. Other nations have grappled with contested elections, executive overreach, and the challenge of holding powerful figures accountable, and their experiences offer both cautionary tales and potential models for resolution. The specific constitutional and legal frameworks in place in the United States create distinctive challenges and opportunities that differentiate this case from foreign analogs, but the underlying dynamics of political competition and institutional stress are broadly shared. Learning from the experiences of others while respecting the particularities of the American system is a delicate but necessary task. The psychological impact on the individuals directly involved in these proceedings, including defendants, witnesses, and their families, is often overlooked in analyses focused on political and legal strategy. The stress of protracted litigation, public scrutiny, and financial uncertainty takes a significant toll that manifests in various ways, from health problems to relationship strain. The decision to cooperate with investigators or to maintain solidarity with former colleagues is not merely a legal calculation, but a deeply personal one that affects intimate relationships and self-conception. Recognizing the humanity of all participants without excusing misconduct is essential to maintaining perspective on the costs of political conflict. The procedural safeguards that govern these prosecutions represent the accumulated wisdom of centuries of legal development aimed at protecting individual rights while enabling effective law enforcement. The presumption of innocence, the right to counsel, and the requirement of proof beyond a reasonable doubt are not mere technicalities, but essential protections against the arbitrary arbitrary exercise of state power. The adherence to these standards, even in cases involving politically charged allegations, is a measure of the health of the legal system and its capacity to deliver justice that is perceived as legitimate. Any erosion of these protections, whether through prosecutorial overreach or political interference, threatens the integrity of the entire enterprise. The role of the judiciary in adjudicating disputes arising from these investigations has been and will continue to be central to their ultimate resolution. Judges have been asked to rule on questions of first impression involving the scope of executive privilege, the validity of legislative subpoenas, and the proper interpretation of statutes never before applied to these specific circumstances. The independence and impartiality of the judiciary are essential prerequisites for public confidence in the outcomes of these proceedings, making attacks on judicial legitimacy particularly damaging to the rule of law. The careful reasoning and adherence to precedent exhibited by courts thus far have provided a measure of stability amid political turbulence. The legislative reforms that may follow from these episodes remain a matter of speculation, but the identification of gaps in existing law has already begun. The adequacy of statutes governing the transition of presidential power, the clarity of prohibitions on interference with electoral processes, and the mechanisms for enforcing congressional subpoenas are all subjects of active debate among policymakers. Whether the political will exists to enact meaningful reforms and whether such reforms would survive judicial scrutiny are questions that will be answered in the coming years. The opportunity to strengthen democratic institutions in response to demonstrated vulnerabilities is one that should not be squandered, regardless of partisan considerations. The role of state and local officials in resisting improper pressure has emerged as a crucial element of the narrative surrounding these events. Election administrators, state legislators, and local judges found themselves on the front lines of efforts to overturn electoral outcomes, and their adherence to legal obligations in the face of intense pressure represents a significant bulwark of democratic resilience. The threats and harassment directed at these officials have highlighted the personal costs of public service and the importance of protecting those who carry out essential democratic functions. Their experiences provide important lessons about the distribution of power in the American federal system and the multiple veto points that can prevent the concentration of authority. The long-term effects on the political party associated with the former president remain uncertain as competing factions vie to define its future direction and identity. The association with controversial conduct and legal jeopardy creates both risks and opportunities for party leaders who must navigate between the demands of a passionate base and the requirements of electoral viability in a diverse nation. The resolution of the current investigations will undoubtedly influence these internal debates, though the ultimate outcome is difficult to predict given the complexity of factional alignments and the fluidity of political circumstance. The capacity of the party to adapt and evolve in response to changing conditions will be tested in the coming electoral cycles. The civic education implications of these proceedings extend to the general public, whose understanding of constitutional principles and governmental processes is being shaped by media coverage of complex legal developments. The gap between the simplified narratives often presented in popular discourse and the nuanced reality of legal proceedings creates challenges for meaningful public engagement with these issues. Opportunities to enhance civic knowledge through attention to real-world applications of constitutional principles should be seized, even as the partisan nature of the underlying disputes complicates educational efforts. A more informed citizenry is essential to the long-term health of democratic institutions, regardless of the immediate outcomes of specific cases. The role of professional ethics in governing the conduct of attorneys involved in these matters has received significant attention, as questions have arisen about the boundaries of zealous advocacy and the obligations of officers of the court. The attorneys representing various parties in these proceedings operate under codes of professional conduct that prohibit false statements to tribunals, frivolous legal arguments, and conduct prejudicial to the administration of justice. The enforcement of these standards through disciplinary proceedings represents a parallel track of accountability that operates independently of criminal or civil liability. The reputation of the legal profession as a whole is affected by the conduct of individual practitioners in high-profile matters, creating incentives for self-regulation that complement external oversight. The intersection of these legal proceedings with the electoral calendar creates both constraints and opportunities for various actors in the political system. The timing of trials, the scheduling of hearings, and the release of investigative reports all have potential consequences for voter perceptions and candidate strategies. The temptation to manipulate these timings for political advantage must be resisted by officials committed to the impartial administration of justice, even as the reality of political context cannot be entirely ignored. The maintenance of clear boundaries between legal and political considerations is essential to preserving public confidence in the integrity of both systems. The evidentiary standards that will govern the ultimate resolution of these cases are rigorous by design, reflecting the serious consequences of criminal conviction and the need to protect against wrongful punishment. The admissibility of evidence, the credibility of witnesses, and the sufficiency of proof will be evaluated according to established rules that have evolved through common law and legislative enactment. The burden of proof borne by the prosecution is intentionally heavy, requiring the elimination of reasonable doubt rather than mere preponderance of evidence. These standards serve as important protections for individual liberty, even as they may frustrate efforts to achieve accountability in cases where misconduct is widely suspected but difficult to prove to the required degree of certainty. The ultimate legacy of these proceedings will depend on their perceived fairness and legitimacy, which in turn rests on the adherence to procedural regularity and the substantive accuracy of outcomes. If the guilty are held accountable and the innocent exonerated through processes that are transparent and impartial, the result may be a strengthening of democratic institutions and a deterrent to future misconduct. If, conversely, the proceedings are perceived as politically motivated or procedurally defective, the result may be further erosion of public trust and a deepening of political divisions. The stakes could hardly be higher, and the responsibility of all participants to uphold the highest standards of conduct is correspondingly great. The judgment of history will be rendered not on the basis of partisan advantage, but on the fidelity to principles that transcend immediate political concerns.